On the 15th of March, 2010, I was sitting in my office, University of Wollongong, and the phone rang. And a woman started telling me a story that I thought was pretty amazing. Her name was Meryl Dorey. And she told me she'd set up an organization, the Australian Vaccination Network, and it had started coming under attack. Now this was of interest to me because I'd been researching scientific controversies for many years, since the 1970s when I was involved in the nuclear power controversy, and then I studied pesticides and fluoridation and so forth. So I had a great interest in scientific controversies and the dynamics of those controversies. And I also was especially interested in dissent in those controversies, but also more widely. And of course, I talked to many whistleblowers, but also talked to a lot of scientists who had dissented from orthodoxy and come under attack. So what Meryl Dorey was telling me was of great interest to me because it combined these two interests. She's telling me basically about being involved in a scientific controversy, but one in which a certain viewpoint was coming under attack. Now, as a prelude to this, I need to say that we're looking at a controversy with both sides have the best of intentions. I know a lot of people don't agree with this, but I'm giving you my point of view. There's different viewpoints about how to go about protecting children's health. That's what's on about. And I've come into this issue as a social scientist. I don't have a strong view about vaccination, but I do have a strong view about freedom of speech. So I'll come back to that. So what I'm going to cover today is three main issues: decision-making processes and policy, then the attack on the critics of vaccination, and finally what I call panic politics, because we've gone past just a freedom of speech issue. So let's look at different ways of making decisions about an issue such as vaccination. The citizens' jury is an idea, and there's New Democracy Foundation's running a whole bunch of these across the country in the past number of years. You randomly pick a group of people from the population, give them information on all sides of the issue, and let them talk about it and work out what they recommend. Lots of research on this that shows it's a very powerful method of citizen participation. That's not the way it's happening in vaccination. Another approach is let the authorities decide what's going to happen. So we get the government makes a policy, they consult with who they think are the experts, and away they go. However, this is sometimes seen in a more authoritarian approach, namely that authorities dictate rather than just decide. Now this approach was fine back in the days when everyone trusted the experts, they trusted the authorities, but there's several things that have happened in the past few decades, especially in relation to vaccination. And the first is a lot of people feel more empowered to learn about things themselves. There's a lot of information, not just on the internet, but all sorts of other ways, and people are well educated and able to find out information and make up their own minds. One important change is back in the 70s and 80s, vaccine development was seen as an altruistic enterprise by scientists who gifted their discoveries to the general purpose because they believed they're trying to help the population. But from the 1980s onwards, pharmaceutical companies became involved and they're profit-making, and they're not gifting the information, the discoveries, to the general public anymore. So people become a bit suspicious as a result of this. And, as I've said, there's a lot more vaccines, as has been said several times today. So these things have changed the situation, so authorities can't dictate nearly as easily as before. And of course, the position that others take is that the parent should be able to decide rather than the authorities deciding or dictating. So that's the background about decision-making methods, and I'll come back to that at the end. So now let's look at the issue which I first alarmed about, found out about and became alarmed in 2010. Australian Vaccination Network, set up in the mid-1990s by Meryl Dorey, and had just been carrying on like a typical citizens group, presenting information, maybe a few protests here and there. Okay, nothing different than I'd seen in all sorts of scientific controversies. But what happened is in 2009, a group called STOP, the Australian Vaccination Network, or SAVN for short, was set up. And SAVN's thank you. SAVN's goal was to shut down, actually to cause the AVN to close down, and its goal was also to silence any public criticism of vaccination. Sounds like a very bold sort of move here. And this is what I've been researching since 2010 and writing about. The methods used for attack, I've classified them into three types: denigration, harassment, and censorship. And what I'm going to do is just give you a few examples of these. Actually, you could mount hundreds of examples of each one of these. And so I'm actually going to give you some of the older ones because you've already heard about some of the recent events. So let's look first at denigration. Includes things like verbal abuse and conspiracy attributions. Namely, initially SAVN said, the AVN believe in a global conspiracy to implant mind-controlled chips via vaccine injections. Absolutely crazy allegation, and it took a long time before they would actually back down from that because they could never provide much evidence. But these sort of things, if you read the SAVN Facebook page, lots and lots of abuse of the critics. And Meryl Dorey was a prime target for a long time. They put out posters like this, and they even set up a special web page to attack Meryl. Now, I decided to start writing about this, and I wrote a paper called Debating Vaccination, Understanding the Attack on the Australian Vaccination Network, and there's free copies of that here. And as a result of writing that, then I came under attack, simply because I was defending free speech and exposing the attacks. Then certain people didn't like me, their complaints to the university, and I got these nice comments, which I love these comments. They give me a real kick. It's my highlight of my day when I read one of these new comments. Now, the next thing, that's denigration. I could go on and on. There's loads and loads of examples of denigration, trying to, basically insulting and dismissing the critics. Let's go on to harassment, which is a bit more serious. You can sometimes ignore comments, but harassment's a different story. And there's three types that I've classified here: complaints, doxing, and threats. So one of the first techniques used by SAVN was to make complaints to official bodies about the Australian Vaccination Network. And so in New South Wales, there's a body called the Healthcare Complaints Commission, which was set up to look at complaints about doctors, nurses, and other health professionals. Now, why would the Australian Vaccination Network, which is an organization of citizens raising concern about an issue of public health, why would they be subject to the Healthcare Complaints Commission process? Well, somehow they decided that this was a concern. They did a sort of sleight of hand to make the AVN seen as a health education organization and therefore subject to their procedures, and away they went. And then the Office of Liquor, Gaming and Racing is about charitable status. They joined in after the HCCC. Department of Fair Trading, which is about basically regulating incorporated bodies. The AVN's an incorporated body, so Department of Fair Trading said, oh, you've got to change your name. This is after a big campaign. They didn't say this to the Labour Party or the Liberal Party, that you've got to change your name. They only said it to one organisation only, the Australian Vaccination Network. There's a big struggle, and they eventually changed their name to the Australian Vaccination Skeptics Network, still the AVN. But that was all a part of the harassment of the organisation, spent untold hours defending. So all those sort of complaints to agencies, that's bad enough. Then there's doxing. Doxing is a process which you put information, usually online, about someone in a circumstance in which they're likely to come under attack, be harassed. And so this group, which is not a Savin group, not openly, they set up the Hall of Shame, and any organization or individual who'd advertised in the AVN's magazine got listed here on this Hall of Shame. And of course, then, even if nothing happens as a result, those people feel afraid as a result because they're being outed. And there's a lot more things that are happening now with complaints about individual practitioners and being subject to investigations by the regulatory agency. So that's what I call harassment. But the third type is threats. And Meryl Dorey can tell you about the threats that she's received. But I think the most objectionable one is pornographic images sent to vaccine critics, either by mail or online. And one of my colleagues studies this sort of issue. I showed him the image, and he said that that would be refused classification. In other words, it's not just normal pornography, it's really horrific stuff. So that's the three types of harassment. Let's go on to censorship. And this could go on. This is the subject of our meeting today, is the censorship of the vaccination debate. But it's not actually censorship of the debate, it's censorship of one side in the debate. And there's a whole series of talks that vaccine critics have organized that have attempts by Savin to shut down the talks. And a typical way is to find out where the talk's going to be held and then contact the venue, send them all sorts of information about how this is terrible, threat to public health, and then the venue gets afraid, and especially if there's lots of things on the Facebook page and Twitter account and so forth, and they cancel the talk. So the reason this talk today was organized so that you only find out the location of the venue at the last moment is to prevent the sort of censorship efforts that have been a regular feature of this debate for a better part of a decade. Now, Stephanie Messenger is a leading Australian vaccination critic. She tried to organize a talk, a whole series of talks by Sherry Tenpenny. Sherry Tenpenny is a prominent US vaccine critic, and the thing is, this was advertised in advance, and so the Saviners and their allies complained of all the venues, and most of them backed out. And so Sherry Tenpenny's talk had to be cancelled. Well, the AVN next decided they'd do things a bit differently. They organized talks. They did screenings of the film Vaxxed in a number of centres, and they did the same thing as with this meeting today, which is to only advertise the location to people who'd signed up in advance a few hours beforehand. And of the speakers there, Polly Tommy from the UK was one. However, when she was going to leave Australia, she's told by immigration, whoops, sorry, you're banned for 3 years. So this is the classic type of censorship seen over and over. Now, I can go into the ways to respond to these forms of attack. I've described the attack in some detail. And I've done a lot of analysis of how anyone subject to an injustice, whether ranging from sexual harassment to genocide, there's all ranges of injustices, how the people who are, you might say, subject to the injustice can defend and actually sometimes make the attacks counterproductive. And so I've gone through all this, but that's covered in my publications, and it's in my book. But what I want to do now is to move from that whole issue about the attacks on vaccine critics, which there's ample evidence, into what is called a moral panic. Now, sociologists, starting in the UK, started looking at certain challenges to the conventional ways of behaving, such as groups called the mods and the rockers. You could, in the UK, and you could call them sometimes, we might say have hippies or rebels, whatever, and they're seen by the way they dress and the way they behave as a threat to the moral order, namely the way that people think things should be carried out. So a threat to values, and then the media get onto this, and they get, oh, there's great stories, there's this threat to our values, and they get big stories about it, and then generates public concern, because the people weren't concerned about it until the media started getting onto it. And then the politicians and other authorities need to respond, because once you get the media onto things and public opinion starts saying this is something to be alarmed about, road rage or same-sex relationships, these are the sort of current things that people might get excited about, then something may happen, some policy change or whatever. So that's the theory of moral panics. Let's apply it to vaccination. And so you've got exactly the same pattern. Even though vaccination doesn't seem like a moral issue, it's been turned into a moral issue because it's seen to be unethical not to have your children vaccinated. And this has turned out to be people whose children are not vaccinated are seen to be bad people. So it's a moral issue, and it's been drummed into excitement by Savin, getting on board regulators and politicians and the media. So that's what I'd see as happening. We've got a moral panic in Australia. So now I'd go back and I'd say, well, this might be reasonable. Is this a reasonable sort of thing to be happening? So I looked back to all my research on scientific controversies and challenges to orthodoxy. And just to give you a couple examples, I've been in the nuclear power debate, and if you're a scientist critical of nuclear power, you might have some troubles, but the ordinary citizen, no dramas. There's loads and loads of citizens, and the government never went in and said, oh, you're not allowed to criticize nuclear power because that's a threat to our way of life. And likewise, pesticides. There's people who are critical of pesticides. They see them as quite harmful. And there's been a debate going on that for decades. And if you're a scientist and you produce some research critical of pesticides, you might have troubles. But the ordinary citizen, they can usually campaign all they like. Nothing's done to shut up a meeting critical of pesticides. But then, okay, vaccination, suddenly it's different, as I've described. So that's what I'd say. The government has jumped in, and as a result of the panic. And so what has the government done? You've heard it already today. No jab, no play, no jab, no pay, removal of conscientious objection, and this one you may not hear about is what I call the marginalization of the pro-vaccination mainstream. So there are a lot of scientists and doctors in the system who they're totally supportive of vaccination, but they don't like no jab, no play, and they don't like no jab, no pay. Why don't they like it? Because they think it's harming children. They're actually concerned about the children first and foremost over the policy. And so you can read their articles, and their comments' effect is they've been excluded from the policy development. So if we look at policy development, citizens' jury, we don't have that at all. The parents decide, that's seen as a no-no, and even the authorities deciding, that's suddenly gone by the board, and we've got panic-driven policy. That's what I'd see is actually going on here. And it's the strange thing is I don't think this is going to end until the medical mainstream decide they're going to speak out and say we want a policy based on what they think is a pro-vaccination, respectful approach. Namely, let people talk, let people decide. We're going to try and argue with them rather than dictate to them. But until the medical mainstream jumps in and does something, I think the panic-driven policy is likely to continue. But who's to say? I'll just say I studied the fluoridation controversy, and I wrote a book published in 1991, and I made a prediction. I don't make many predictions because social scientists are not good as predictors, but I said this controversy is likely to be continuing on decades from today. Okay, so that's it's going on 30 years since. And I knew it was a safe prediction because it had been going on since the 1950s. So I'm there writing in 1991, well, it's been going on for decades, it's going to go on more decades. Well, I shouldn't tell you this to discourage you from continuing, but it's a process rather than a sudden success. Now, the conclusions or the insights from the studies that I've made here, you can read them for yourself, but what's strange about this debate, most of the scientific controversies I've looked at, one side there's citizen campaigners, the other side there's a bunch of authorities, powerful interest groups, whether government or industry. This one we've got campaigners who are citizen campaigners on both sides, who are the driving forces, and they've got the same ultimate goal but different methods. I've described the methods by which the pro-vaccination campaigners have tried to silence any criticism, and it results in what I called a moral panic. But the final thing I want to comment here is one of the consequences of the moral panic is that other routes to immunity are being forgotten. So we've got this thing, everyone's focusing on vaccine-created immunity or lack of vaccine-created immunity. And there's other ways to develop your immunity, and you can find plenty of scientific articles to support each one of these. Nutrition, exercise, diet, mindfulness, and there's a bunch of others you can find as well. So the strange thing is these things are being totally forgotten because everyone's so excited about vaccination, either supporting it or opposing it, that they forget that we live in a wider world in which other things can make a difference. So I don't have a single message for you, but to say these issues are not likely to go away, but it's wider than just vaccination, no vaccination. It's really how do we want to live our lives. Thank you very much.